So we are here with Anisha Sharma. Anisha Sharma is a professor at Ashoka University in Delhi, India. She is a professor of economics. Anisha has her undergraduate degree in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and she has graduate degrees in economics from the University of Oxford. Actually, full disclosure, we know each other from Oxford because we both went to Oxford for our DPhils. I think you graduated a year after me with your DPhil in economics. Anisha also has some policy expertise, having been an ODI fellow for the government of South Africa during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. You kind of helped steer them through it. Today, we're going to talk about India. Today, we're going to talk about how India specifically is dealing with coronavirus. And India, as a less developed country, has some particularly unique challenges in confronting this pandemic. So, first of all, I'd like to give you some raw numbers. The raw numbers I saw, and these are rough figures, right? So, the raw numbers I saw from India seem on the surface to actually look pretty good for a country of more than a billion people. There are about 6,200 cases of coronavirus in India. Compare that to Canada, where there are over, I think now, 20,000 cases. 6,200 cases in India and fewer than 200 deaths from the coronavirus in India. Now, India, as I mentioned, faces some unique challenges, and those numbers, to be fair, could be because there's not enough testing that's being done, right? We can always talk about testing as a unique challenge for India fighting the coronavirus. For example, though, in India, I understand that the government has already sent direct cash transfers to the poor, and there is a nationwide lockdown in effect until April 14th, although we were talking before and you mentioned some state governments have already extended that lockdown. On the other hand, India is not testing many people per capita, and its medical system appears to be ill-equipped to handle a pandemic of this size. And when we talk about India now, I should mention India is a very diverse country, right? I mean, Gujarat is as different from Tamil Nadu as South America is from North America in many ways, right? You can't really talk about one India. But that being the case, from your perspective, what has the Indian government and what have the state governments done right and what have they done wrong in confronting this COVID-19?
So, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. Great to be here. I think the Indian government made a really good start early on. They were very quick to recognize that this was going to be a big issue if COVID was to spread very rapidly in India. The healthcare system would just not be able to cope with a rapid expansion in the number of cases, and it would just be completely overwhelmed. And this contrasts quite well with other governments, such as, for example, the US government or the Brazilian government, or for slightly different reasons, the British government. They were very quick to recognize that this was going to be a big issue. And so they started screening international travelers from Southeast Asia and East Asia really early on. They were able to use a disease surveillance network that had been kind of well established during previous epidemics, such as avian flu, H1N1, more recently the Nipah virus, where they do a pretty good job actually of identifying who is sick, testing them, quarantining them, tracing all of their contacts, sanitizing everywhere they've been, and so on and so forth. But of course, with COVID, as with I think happened in so many other countries as well, just the sheer pace with which cases have started increasing just overwhelmed the existing disease surveillance network. And so the government recognized at some stage that they've got one of two options here. One is that they either get large numbers of people to conform with norms such as social distancing and working from home and so on, or they enforce a really strict lockdown. And I think the Indian government took the call that these social norms just aren't going to fly in India. If you offer a young, poor Indian person, on the one hand, you don't work for 3 weeks, and on the other hand, well, you might get the flu, they're not going to stay at home, right? They're going to go and work. And so they decided to go in for a very, very strict lockdown. And in fact, the lockdown restrictions here, now some other countries are catching up, as we just discussed, in Canada as well. But it's basically been stricter than anywhere outside of China. And, if you go out, you can get arrested if you're not out shopping for essential commodities, or you could get beaten up by the cops. So it's being very, very harshly policed in India.
And it's
I
not
think
military it's not a military lockdown yet, is it? Just to
no,
be clear, okay.
Yeah, it's just being managed by the cops right now. So the state police in every single state will be managing enforcement of the lockdown directives. And I think that's when the entire policy started kind of, the wheels started falling off the policy, because it's become clear now that the lockdown and the impacts of the lockdown were not clearly thought through by the government. So
Mhm.
an immediately visible sign of this was thousands of migrant workers in big cities kind of streaming into bus stations and train stations, trying really hard to get back home. No certainty at all about where they would stay. Some of them were walking home and cycling home huge distances, potentially carrying the virus back with them. The ones who are staying in the cities are stuffed into these night shelters, which not large enough to accommodate them, or in community kitchens where they're trying to get meals. There have been a lot of challenges with maintaining supply chains of essential commodities. Because there was a lot of confusion over what constitutes an essential commodity, a lot of the state police would stop trucks at the borders and turn them back, saying, you're carrying tomatoes. We're not sure if that's allowed. You just go back to where you came from. This has created uncertainty all the way up the agricultural supply chain as well, and led to a lot of farmers now losing money, because this is this is the harvest time for one of the two agricultural seasons. And so since the lockdown got announced, governments across the country have basically been playing catch up and trying very hard to mitigate some of these high costs of the lockdown. In addition to trying to ramp up testing and developing the healthcare infrastructure to be able to manage a rapid increase in cases.
Fair enough. Now, I'm interested in your background because you, as a researcher, are both a labor and a development economist, which I believe puts you in a very useful position to analyze this crisis. And in fact, along with with your Ashoka University co-authors, you've co-authored 2 articles in The Wire, which is an Indian news and opinion website. With the Indian news website articles, you lay out a number of economic policies for the Indian government in tackling COVID-19 in the country. From an economic point of view, you talked about the poor, we talked about these essential commodities. Because these programs are integral to your scheme, and for my listeners' benefit, could you just start by explaining what the PDS system is in India and what ration cards are? Because I think that's pretty integral to your scheme, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. So the PDS is the public distribution system, which is basically the government institution that's responsible for distributing essential food and some non-food commodities to poor families across the country. It's this enormous machinery that on the one hand procures agricultural goods like wheat, rice, sugar, cooking oil, and so on from farmers, and then makes this available through a very wide network of fair price shops at highly subsidized prices to eligible families. Eligible families are given a ration card, which basically spells out their entitlements, how much they're allowed to buy of each good, and at what price from a particular ration shop. And so the PDS system really underpins food security in India.
I see. So not now much of the response to COVID-19 is going to involve economists, as we know. I mean, in Canada, for example, we are just told today that 1 million people lost their jobs in the country as a result of the virus. And in India, I'm sure it's many, many more. Much of the response involves economists. So with that in mind, could you please lay out the specific policy directives that you lay out? And these are evidence-based directives in your WIRE proposals. And I will link those articles below in the description box.
Okay, so we make proposals which are basically designed to address the economic hardships that are associated with COVID-19 and the lockdown. So we don't speak explicitly about ramping up, healthcare infrastructure and all of that. Obviously, that's super important. But we focus here on mitigating the economic costs of the pandemic and of the lockdown. And we basically have a 3-pronged strategy that we outline. The first is that during the period of lockdown, which is a time where there's basically no economic activity for many, many households, the government must make a cash transfer to all eligible households. We define eligibility broadly. So any household that has a ration card, right? So they're already eligible to buy food at subsidized prices. All of these households should receive a cash transfer from government as well, at least as long as the lockdown is on. We did some calculations based on poverty line estimates to come up with what we basically think is an absolute minimum for the cash transfer in urban and rural areas. And we think that this cash transfer can be made fairly efficiently through existing digital payments interface that is already linking people's ration cards to their bank accounts. This needs to be supported with in-kind transfers through the public distribution system. This is important because during this crisis, and we've seen already, there's a lot of hoarding that takes place. There are supply chain disruptions. The prices of food can go up quite rapidly, which can erode the value of the cash transfer quite quickly. At the same time, access to a ration shop in many places might be easier than access to an ATM or to a bank, especially during this period. So food must be supplied through these ration shops at subsidized prices, not just the existing entitlement, but even more than that. So the government has already announced a doubling of existing entitlements. And so we support that the government has done this, and we think that they should continue with that. And so the third part of this three-tier policy is that in addition to supporting the ration shops and the public distribution system, the supply chain for a wide range of other commodities also needs to be managed, especially agricultural commodities. The government took a far too narrow view of what constituted essential commodities, which put a lot of farmers into distress. They weren't able to get their goods out and get them into markets. This needs to stop now. Specific steps need to be taken to make sure goods keep flying, and farmers especially are able to reach agricultural markets and ensure that from there households are also able to access that produce, in order to keep prices down, in order to keep incomes flowing, and in order to prevent shortages. And I think what brings all these three kind of strategies together is that all of these should be pre-announced so that people know what their entitlements are before a lockdown begins. It's quite possible, as we just discussed, that the lockdown might get extended from April 14th. In fact, one state government's already pushed it out to April 30th. If we believe some of the epidemiological modeling, COVID might be back in winter. And so we might have more lockdowns then. So these are announcements that need to be made in advance of locking down, not with the government playing catch up and saying, okay, now we'll do this and now we'll plug this gap there and so on. In addition to that, in our piece, we also discuss a number of particularly vulnerable groups who will not be well served even by these three approaches. So migrant workers are an example I've already discussed. Because ration cards are given to households, migrants who are not with their households might not actually have their ration card with them. Their family is getting the benefit of it back home, but they don't have access to food. So we also outline a kind of a number of measures that need to be instituted in order to provide for people who are excluded from the cash and in-kind transfers that we think should be a part of the government's policy.
I'd like to just go off on that cash transfer policy. Based on your article, and I'm looking at the numbers here from your article, one of your policy suggestions is a direct cash transfer to ration card holders with 4,300 rupees for urban households per household and 2,300 per rural household. This will end up costing 55,000 crore rupees or $10 billion Canadian, if I do the math. In your article, you mentioned that this is based on a poverty rate calculation, which involves past data. Now, in the pandemic, as you mentioned actually in the article itself, in figure 1, there will be a drastic increase in the price of basic food commodities. And you did mention that these in-kind transfers of food directly to farmers or directly to the poor, directly to people below a certain poverty line cutoff, should be made available by the government. In addition, just to supplement that, is there a direct cash transfer enough, given the fact that not only the prices of essential commodities, but the prices of potentially everything could go up during this crisis due to supply line shortages?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a real concern. And that's why we say that, the cash transfers must work as complements with the in-kind transfers. They cannot completely substitute for in-kind transfers. I think the way to keep prices down is to put a lot more effort into maintaining supply chains and ensuring that those keep flowing. And that can take a lot of pressure off the government in terms of having to compensate larger and larger sums to households just because the supply chains aren't working. But I agree with you, the amounts are an absolute minimum. One could imagine that people should receive even higher amounts. So for kind of a companion piece that we do for an IGC blog, Ideas for India, we do a separate calculation, not based on the poverty line, but based on lost wages, estimated lost wages per day in rural areas and in urban areas. So those figures are a little bit higher, about 5,500 rupees for urban households for a typical urban household of four, and 4,400 rupees for a typical rural household of four. But even that value can get eroded pretty quickly if not enough is done to make sure that supplies keep flowing.
Can
That is
you
really critical.
can you foresee those cash transfers being higher
Mm.
if the government lockdown continues? In other words, would you keep having those cash transfers if the government decides to extend the lockdown, let's say until July?
That's the plan. So the way we have outlined it in our policy brief is to say that as long as any area is under lockdown, all the households in that area should receive this transfer. That is to some extent a little conservative. You could argue that just because the lockdown ends doesn't mean that you get up the next day and suddenly find your job back again. And so the negative effects of lockdown could extend well beyond the actual removal of restrictions. So one could even make a case for having transfers that extend beyond the period of the lockdown. But with fiscal sustainability in mind, we recommend a figure that is lockdown related. It's possible that national lockdown gets lifted, but there are sporadic outbreaks in different states and different cities, and different districts need to be locked down. Then those transfers need to be made to households in those districts. So basically, target the cash transfers and in-kind transfers to households located in an area where they literally cannot go to work.
Right. Now, although a lot of this involves stuff working at the political level, let's be quite honest, right? And I know you have some government experience with the government of South Africa. I don't know where you based, Pretoria or Johannesburg. I'm not sure.
I was in Pretoria.
You were in Pretoria, all right.
Yeah.
So you were in Pretoria. You have some firsthand experience of how the government works in actuality. And and you also live in Delhi. The Delhi is the site of the national government in India, and you helped the South African government with the financial crisis a little bit, and you live in Delhi, so you can observe this firsthand. What are the practical and political constraints of implementing your policies?
So it's interesting you mentioned the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, I think what is so remarkably different with the current pandemic, especially for emerging market economies, is that EMs were relatively protected during the financial crisis. Just because they were less integrated with the global financial system. Yes, they had to do a lot of work in shoring up regulatory structures. They had to inject a lot of kind of stimulus funding and so on into the financial system in order to compensate for the global recession. But it was nowhere near the scale of the hardship that you're seeing right now in the developing world, or indeed in any country that's affected by the pandemic. So to me, the biggest challenge here is going to be wrapping your head around really high fiscal transfers that are much higher than what is widely considered macroeconomically sustainable for a developing country. A country like the US can easily spend 10% of GDP. But because the US dollar is a reserve currency, they can get away with printing a lot of money. That can be particularly challenging for developing countries like India, which are trying very hard to stick to very conservative fiscal deficits. I think we have a target of 3.5%, which, well, frankly, the government needs to just forget about that. A lot of economists have suggested we should be spending at least 5% of GDP in trying to compensate for the costs of COVID. And that's a tough call to make. If it goes wrong, you could have a currency in free fall. You could have a macroeconomic external crisis on your hands before you know it. And so I would imagine that that's a big challenge. A second challenge, which is related, is just the sheer uncertainty about what's going to happen in the next few months. So it's quite possible that government is holding back on spending now, just because they don't know what lies in store. Is this going to get worse in a few months? Should we keep the powder dry for then? So far, I think only about 1% of GDP has been announced as a COVID package, which is far too low. But I would imagine that that a lot of people are just really worried about pushing that number up higher, especially in a developing country that was already showing some signs of economic slowdown in the last few months.
I wonder if you could speculate a little bit about the political ramifications in India. As we mentioned, India is a diverse country. It's comprised of several states. If a particular region of India, like let's say Tamil Nadu, I know Tamil Nadu has many, many cases of coronavirus. if a particular region of India gets a whole bunch of funding as a result of the coronavirus aid package, can there be a little bit of a tension politically between, say, Tamil Nadu and another state which doesn't get as much funding? How would that play out in the case of
I
India?
think to some extent, this kind of wrangling over financing happens in any case on a yearly basis. So the federal system here is much more centralized than it is in, say, the US or in Canada. And so the government, the central government that is already making a lot of horizontal transfers to ensure some kind of parity across states. So in any case, every year we get complaints from relatively well-off states like Gujarat and Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, which say that always we're not getting enough money for all the taxes that we are pouring in. And poorer states tend to get more money. That's going to happen here too, because even if poorer states are less likely to have more cases, just because they tend to be more rural, maybe fewer connections or fewer big cities where there are more people who are carrying the virus, their state capacity to handle the crisis is also that much lower. And so I can foresee Tamil Nadu government saying that we are not getting as much money as we should get because, given the number of cases that we do have, because you just assume that we have high state capacity and so we can handle this crisis by ourselves. And yeah, I mean, that's just going to be another source of tension, especially with tax receipts falling thanks to the slowdown that's happening right now. This is going to become even harder. There's going to be just that much more fighting over how to divide up the COVID package. That's going to be a big challenge going forward, I think.
And I think India has been contrasted in this crisis against China, and it's been contrasted even prior to this crisis against China. India's manufacturing capacity has dropped a little bit, and I believe in response to this crisis too, and this is a little bit unrelated, but Modi, I believe, banned exports of certain types of pharmaceuticals from India. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I would like to ask related to that is that we keep hearing that there's going to be a trade-off between economic growth and fighting the coronavirus, right? You mentioned that this economists say 5% of GDP needs to be put into fighting the coronavirus. And I used to believe this to some extent, but now this is somewhat illusory to me based on the discussions I've had over the past week with physicians and economists. Ultimately, a virus itself is an economic threat. An unhealthy workforce, after all, is not a workforce. To what extent do you believe that there is a trade-off in the case of India between economic growth and fighting the coronavirus?
This is a tough question. I would put it like this. I mean, this so-called trade-off, as you say, between lockdown costs versus pandemic costs. We know what the costs are quite clearly on one side of that picture, right? We know what the lockdown costs are, and they are staggeringly high in a country like India. And in many ways, actually, a lockdown is a health crisis. It is a health crisis because a first-order concern in a poor country, unlike in the West, is that people could starve. It's that children are going to be even more malnourished than they already are, with long-term consequences for them. It's households cutting back on healthcare expenses because they can't afford, diabetes drugs anymore or hypertension medication anymore. So a lockdown and a big squeeze on incomes is a health crisis. And it's a health crisis and a developmental crisis of staggering proportions. On the other side of the coin, the cost of the pandemic, I don't know about you, but I, for one, I mean, we're just not very clear on what those costs are. It could be catastrophic, much worse than even the cost of the lockdown. It could not. There are all these theories floating around about how Indians have better immunity because of the BCG vaccine. Maybe the heat will make it go away. Maybe it's going to come back again, or maybe our exposure to high levels of air pollution makes us more vulnerable. We just don't have any idea. So because I have no idea, I don't want to second guess the lockdown. So let's just assume that maybe, this lockdown is necessary, and we just don't know if it is, but maybe it is. And let's say we have this lockdown. Given the lockdown, what is not negotiable is extensive government spending and generous government spending to compensate for the known costs of the lockdown at the kind of the individual and the household level. So that number, whatever it is, 5% of GDP, for example, let's say that's the number. That amount is non-negotiable because we know those costs are really high, and we know that this is something that just has to be done in order to compensate for some of these economic hardships that people are going to suffer. And in some sense, it also puts a price on the lockdown. That as long as you are able to afford making those kinds of social transfers, you can go ahead and decide that this is the lockdown that you need to institute. But I don't think you should contemplate a lockdown without this kind of support. It's going to be far too cruel, and it's going to be unsustainable.
Now, a number of commentators, I did talk about China before. I'd like to just plant that in my listeners' mind as we talk about this next question. A number of commentators are now noticing that it was perhaps unwise to rely exclusively on China for essential products such as pharmaceuticals and face masks and PPE. Do you foresee this pandemic causing a reorientation of global trade away from China and towards India? I mean, India has many of the advantages that China does. If you're looking at supply chains, it has cheap labor, it has pretty decent ports that are able to export goods. Will this crisis cause people to look more carefully towards India? Do you imagine that happening? Because I do see a lot of commentators remarking on that.
I think this is one of those things that's easier said than done. I agree with you. I think there will be a political push or maybe a strategic push from some quarters to reduce reliance on China in particular. But you talked about the pharmaceutical industry. India is actually one of the largest producers of pharmaceuticals in the world and the largest exporters of pharmaceuticals in the world. And in fact, you just mentioned how Modi banned the export of pharmaceuticals because he was very worried about availability of hydroxychloroquine in case it turns out to be this kind of magic silver bullet that's going to fix this. And that would have major consequences globally because we're such a major exporter. But even in an industry where we do have a lot of advantage, most of the raw materials, the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into these drugs, come from China. So the supply chain is complex and it's globally integrated. It starts in China, and then those inputs reach India, and then they get made into drugs there, and then those get exported all over the world. And I think there's a reason for that. And the reason is that China's manufacturing capacity is just far ahead of any other countries. And so even if you want to step away from them, most developing countries have wanted to replicate that at some level.
Do you believe,
certainly,
just to jump in there, do you believe that there could be an element of the fact that India is a democracy and therefore the workers in India, at least prima facie, have more rights than workers in China, and therefore that kind of pushes labor costs a little bit up for let's say Western corporations who want to manufacture in India?
maybe labor costs are a part of it, but Chinese labor costs have gone up substantially in the last few years, right? Just because Chinese incomes have gone up and living standards have gone up. I think they do a lot more besides just keep worker costs down. They have just been really good at doing industrial policy. And in the last 20, 30 years, there are very few countries that have managed that. The scale of their investments, very often direct subsidies from the state. And one thing that they've done that we really have fallen back on is developed a skilled, well-trained, healthy workforce that can man these factories, and that can produce the required goods. We just haven't done enough on most of these fronts. And so there's a reason that we haven't got the right policy environment to replicate the kind of manufacturing growth that China has seen. And so while countries may want to step into this breach and use this opportunity where possible, it's going to be tough. It's going to be pretty difficult, I think.
Now, following on the China question, I wonder if you think that this crisis will force us to rewrite economics textbooks to be at least more nuanced, if not rewrite the theories entirely. I'll give you an example. We teach first-year students the pure theory of comparative advantage. Basically, one country has a comparative advantage or is better at producing wine. One country is better at producing socks or cheese, and therefore this country should produce only cheese and this country should produce only wine. Or, to be more drastic, one country is better at producing pharmaceuticals and that country should only produce pharmaceuticals. Now, in this crisis, if this country here, and I'm talking about China, of course, if this country completely locks down, is not able to export, it goes to war, it has a pandemic, or just blows up in the face of everything, there's a revolution, that's a problem for the pure theory of Ricardian comparative advantage, right? So do you believe, just as an economist, that this will force us to be a bit more nuanced, at the very least, in the writing of our economics textbooks?
That's a really interesting question. I think it has to, right? In many ways, this is kind of like what the East Asian crisis did for understanding financial contagion, which was, well, I guess a little bit before yours and my time, in the sense that we won't have come to a textbook before. But I believe that the understanding of how financial shocks propagate through increasingly integrated global systems, globalized financial systems, really got a complete relook after the East Asian financial crisis. And in many ways, this could do that for the real economy. At the very least, as you say, comparative advantage doesn't go away, but we should understand how supply shocks can propagate very, very rapidly in an environment like the current one. You know, flights being shut down is just unprecedented, what we've seen in terms of drop in air travel, the drop in sea travel, and what that's done for supply and demand around the world is just extraordinary. So I can imagine just at least understanding how reliant the entire global supply chain is on this kind of just-in-time management, movement of goods and people all over the world, how reliant that is on all parts of this kind of well-oiled system functioning. One part of it snaps, then you've got a problem. And this is important, right? Because one can imagine with climate change related disruptions, I mean, maybe this kind of thing is going to happen more and more going forward, not just because of pandemics. You could have an adverse weather event and then your supply chain could break again.
Right. Now, for a person who wants to go beyond the textbooks and actually wants to consider a career as an economist, that is, they want to do graduate school in economics, what would you suggest before he or she enters graduate school in terms of specific advice? I know you have, after all, you have 2 master's degrees. You have one in financial economics and one, I believe, in economics for development, and you have a PhD in economics as well. What specific advice would you suggest? And I mean, now we have a pandemic, so perhaps it's not the best time to think about all of these things. But after the pandemic is over, we'll still want people to go into economics programs, right? So what specific advice would you suggest for these people?
Well, you know what they say, right? Anytime there's a recession, then more and more people enroll in PhD programs in graduate school. So we'll actually probably see an increase in enrollments taking place in the next year or so.
Maybe.
Yeah. In terms of specific advice, I mean, I find that students, especially from countries like India, and I'm sure this is less true in North America, students, I don't think, understand the kind of incentives related to doing a PhD very well. And I think there's some sense of going into graduate school or going into a PhD program. If you got really good grades at the undergraduate level, or you did quite well in the master's program, and hey, why not just drift into a PhD program? Sounds like a great deal. But I think that's, it's becoming clearer and clearer that that's not a good idea. Certainly because of COVID, I'm hearing now about how educational systems around the world are probably going to reduce hiring and they're going to be put in financial squeezes. And I think this is a really good time to really evaluate that trade-off in terms of what you are doing a PhD for. And in particular, what is the kind of lifestyle that you think you are buying into? It's not just about getting a degree because, you're smart or it might be fun or whatever it is. It's about really buying into a particular kind of lifestyle. I suppose to some extent in economics, we're a little bit protected because there are, a lot of outside options for PhD students who don't want to go into academia. But I think most students should really think seriously about whether they want the academic life at the time that they are deciding whether or not to go into graduate school, and not just drift into it because, it seems like something they might be good at.
And there's an opportunity cost, right? And the time you're spending in graduate school, you're not really making much money. Whereas when you're working after a master's degree, let's say, you're going to be making quite a bit of money. So I guess you have to look at that trade-off. In other words, I don't think going and doing a PhD in economics is a get-rich-quick scheme, as some people might seem to think, right?
No, not at all. Not in the least. I mean, it is maybe for a handful of people at a handful of universities. But it's quite a tough slog, and it's quite a niche life post PhD. So I think more students should really evaluate those options carefully. And it's hard to know when you don't have people around you who can advise you. So talk to people. Talk to people who are doing PhDs right now. Talk to people who just exited a PhD program. Talk to people who dropped out of a PhD program. This is really useful in trying to understand whether this is really for you.
Great advice. Great advice. Now, last question. Where can we find you? Are you on Twitter? What's your webpage? And by the way, I will link all of this below in the description.
Yeah, I am on Twitter. So that's AS Anisha Sharma. And I think there's a link to my webpage in my Twitter handle as well. So you can find me through Twitter.
All right, fantastic. All right, thank you, Anisha, and have a good day and stay safe in India.
Thank you. You too, Cornelius. Take
Cheers.
care.
Bye.